Hello and welcome back to this section on 3-bet pots, blinds versus imposition, and we're still talking about c-betting on connected flops, but in this video I'm just going to talk about the adjustments we make when it's not small blind versus button. So I'm going to start by talking about when we're still in the small blind but our opponent is in a different position, and then I'm going to go on to talking about when we're actually in the big blind and see what changes in these different scenarios. So let's click through to it. And so when we're in the small blind and we're playing against an earlier position, villain's range is getting tighter, containing fewer low cards and a greater proportion of high pairs. And this means we do a little bit worse on the higher flops and better on the lower flops than we do versus button. And this just means, first of all, that we can't c-bet 100% on the ace-high 3 broadways, although we're still c-betting around a high frequency, but just you can imagine on, say, an ace-jack-10 or something, our opponent, if they're under the gun, is going to be flatting jacks and tens rather than 4-betting them a lot of the time. So now they've got more sets there, and they might also have more 2 pairs on ace-king-queen, for example, where they're flatting a lot more ace-king and so on than they were when they're on the button. So our opponent's just doing a bit better there when they're in an earlier position. I mean, we're kind of doing better as well, but it's more significant for our opponent, and therefore our frequency just going down a little bit to high rather than 100%. And on the flip side, it's going significantly up on wheelboards, our frequency. So it's increasing to more of a mid frequency. Adjusted for the exact boards, it would still be less on the ace-3 deuce, which was particularly bad for us. But on other wheelboards, it would be a bit better for us. And overall, sort of a mid frequency on wheelboards is going to be fine, and that's just because our opponent has less of the low pairs when they're the earlier position, less cards which are going to hit 2 pair and so on. So we just do a little bit better there, and therefore going up to a mid frequency. Our frequency is going down on king to 10 high flops as we get to playing versus hijack and under the gun. So villain tends to hit pretty well here now, and we're getting to more like mid frequencies versus hijack and mid-low versus under the gun. It's just, again, you can imagine on some board like Queen Jack 9 or King Jack 10 or something, now our opponent's just got quite a lot of I guess sets particularly that they didn't necessarily have so many of versus buttons. So these boards were, and maybe more straights as well and so on, so like comparative to their whole range. So we're not doing as well here, and whereas these were boards we were betting much more often on versus button, now we're having to go down to, like I say, sort of a mid-frequency versus hijack and even mid-low versus under the gun on these boards. Also, part of the reason here is that our opponent's just losing the lower card hands from their range, so just a greater proportion of their range is these sort of more middle type hands, like the higher connected hands and higher pairs and so on. So yeah, they're doing better on these boards. Our sizing does go up to pot though on these boards, and that's just because we pretty much only have an advantage around sort of aces, kings, which our opponent still doesn't have so much of because they're four betting them a lot. So when that's pretty much where our advantage is coming in the range, that's where we're basing our betting range around those hands, and the size that those hands are happy to bet on this sort of board tends to be around pot. So yeah, we're just increasing our sizing from the 0.6 times pot that we were getting on the Queen to 10 high flops, for example, versus button. And of course that progressively gets bigger as you're going from button to cut off to hijack, and then under the gun you're reaching pot. Pot works okay for hijack as well, but yeah, it's kind of going up from where it was when our opponent was on the button. We also do a little bit better on low boards versus other position, and our ranges are based around the high overpairs where we have an advantage in the ranges. So with villain has less 2 pair because they don't have so many of these low card hands on low boards, and therefore these the top overpairs like aces and kings, which our opponent still isn't necessarily flatting very often pre-flop, they have a larger natural size when they have less 2 pair plus. So when we're playing versus the button, our opponent has a bunch of these sort of straights and 2 pairs and sets and so on. When they have less of those hands, when they're in an earlier position and they're like raise calling less of those hands pre-flop, then our aces and kings they beat more of our opponent's range than they did when our opponent was on the button. So aces and kings naturally have a a bigger natural size than they did when our opponent was on the button for that reason. And also, yeah, we're just basing our hands sort of basing our sizing, our ranges around those sort of hands where we have an advantage in the ranges. So our sizing goes up to 1.1 times pot when we get to playing versus under the gun on these sort of boards, and it was it was like 0.9 times pot when it was button, so it's not going up hugely, but it's just going up a little bit, and it's one of those things that if you don't remember, it's not the end of the world, but it is just perhaps worth noting, and maybe it'll stick, that you do want to increase your sizes slightly on these lower boards. And finally, of course, we're also including some shoves versus under the gun on flops with 2 of a suit. And it even is kind of more clear why the merge shoves are so good in this scenario. So I'm going to be going through one of the hand selection boards that I'm going through in the next video is going to be one of these scenarios, because I think it really shows things clearly why the merge shoves are good. So we'll go over that in the next video. So I think that should be good for small blind versus other position adjustments. If we go on to the big blind, and things are very similar here as they were for disconnected flops. Our pre-flop 3-betting range has more weak hands in it when we're in the big blind than when we're in the small blind. Feel free to rewatch the disconnected flop video on this if you want a refresher of why that is, but it's exactly the same phenomenon going on. So we tend to hit high boards not quite as well as we do when we're in the small blind, and low boards a bit better than we did in the small blind. So we still do better on higher boards than low boards in general, but the difference is just less stark than it was when we were in the small blind. And so some of the adjustments we make for this reason is that our frequency is going to go down to mid-high on ace-high 3 broadways, rather than the 100% that we were seeing small blind versus button, and then frequencies going up to mid-low on wheel boards rather than lower than that as it was small blind versus button, and then finally frequency goes up above mid-low on low boards, whereas it's kind of low to mid-low small blind versus button. So when we're in the big blind, going up above mid-low. So exactly the same thing as we had for disconnected flops, but just things going less to the extremes because of the fact that we've got more weak hands and less of the sort of middle strong hands in our 3-bet range. So hopefully that's easy enough to understand because it's so similar to the disconnected flop. So if you got the hang of that, then hopefully this will be easy to kind of add on to that and implement into your games. So that's it for the adjustments, and the next video I'm going to make is about hand selection, where we're going to go through 2 flops, one of them being a Queen Jack 9 rainbow for small blind versus button, and the other one being a small blind versus under gun spot on 7-6-5 with a suit where we have a shoving range. So we're going to go over that in the next video, and I think it's going to be a good one, so tune in for that.